Securing your Azure resources couldn't be easier. We have a feature called Security Center. It's sort of like the guardian angel for all your resources. It just sits there watching your infrastructure and alerts you to anything that needs to be addressed. Say, for example, you're not using multi-factor authentication. It'll actually alert you to that and then give you remediation steps on how to go enable multi-factor authentication. It's not a, this is broken, now go figure out how to fix it. It's that this is broken and here's exactly how to go to fix it. I remember I didn't have the right encryption on my databases and it alerted me to it. I literally clicked a single button and it went and encrypted all of my data at rest. It's monitoring what type of compliances that you need. If you're processing credit cards, you gotta be PCI compliant. It'll actually go through all the regulations, look at your infrastructure, and tell you where you need to go and secure your infrastructure to make sure that you are PCI compliant, HIPAA compliant. Whatever compliance or governance that you have, Security Center is already designed to be watching your infrastructure to make sure that it complies to those governances. And it can also go back in and look for attacks that are happening against your infrastructure and help you make sure you're not having a denial of service attack or a brute force attack. Help you secure your infrastructure, and all you have to do is use Azure. The rest of it just happens.
Hey everybody, thank you Donovan, I appreciate that introduction. Welcome back to AzureFunBytes. My name is Jay Gordon. Every week, what do we do here? Well, we get together and we talk about the different services, the products, all the things that help you have an amazing experience using Azure. So last time we got together, we talked about Azure Data Factory. And if you want to see the video, it's up on YouTube. Thanks a lot to Mark, who really gave us a great session. We learned a ton about what it is exactly, how it works, and how to create a pipeline for your data. But there's more than just creating your pipeline. Once you've actually established your ETL process, you've got your pipeline, you got to be concerned with all these different endpoints, all these different touch points that are going to happen along the way. And so to help me, I have yet another member of the Data Factory team. It's Abishek. Hi, Abishek. How are you today?
Hey, Jay. I'm doing great. How about you?
I'm having a great day. One of the things that makes it great is that I get to spend some time with you talking about what exactly these products are and how we secure them. And I think that that's one of the most important parts. And so if you're currently watching and you're in the chat, why don't you sound off, let us know that you're here. And along with that, we're going to be able to take your questions. So if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. And the easiest place for you to go to send those questions, and it's the same place we have our poll every week, is Learn TV. And so this week, what's our poll? We're asking if you currently have a data pipeline or ETL process in flight at your company. Let us know. I think it helps kind of give us an idea of who's watching and what they're up to. So Abishek, let's talk a little bit more about you, because one of the things I like to do is I want our audience to kind of get to know you and understand what you do. But first, how'd you get to Microsoft, and what are you up to now?
Sure. And thank you, Jay, for having me on the show. And hello, everyone who's watching this show. So thanks for watching this show. Now, a bit of introduction about me. So I work as a senior program manager in the Azure Data Factory team. So, and I pretty much focus on security, and that's pretty much the topic that we're going to talk about today. And I work on a few other things, which is adding external orchestration into ADF so that you can do data processing using external activities, things like data breaks and stuff within ADF. And as I said, I'm pretty much interested in security and help the team build more security-related functionalities and features into ADF. And prior to this, I've been in Microsoft for almost 10 years now, and I've been doing different roles, being a consultant. I've worked on .NET in those days gone by, worked on applications as well, mobile applications, Windows applications. So I do have that .NET and the dev background, and now I get to work with data engineers in Data Factory team.
Well, that's Incredible stuff. And let everybody know where you're actually broadcasting from today.
Sure. So I'm based out of Shanghai. So I'm broadcasting from Shanghai, but yeah, I'm happy to, I know your show has audiences from across the globe, so happy to be on the show.
Yeah, I also know that you're coming to me. It's 2:06 in the morning, and so I hope you've got some tea or some coffee or something to help you through this. And I appreciate you making some time out of your evening to spend with us. So we're obviously going to be talking about Azure Data Factory and how we secure that in the cloud. And just to give everybody a reminder, well, the big idea is that it's an ETL process that is essentially a no-code type of way of doing it using Azure Data Factory. I think it's really, really great because what it allows people to do is to extract their data, transform it, and then load it into whatever service, say, be it SQL, MongoDB API for Cosmos DB, you name it. There are all these different options. But one of the things I know, Abishek, that we're going to be talking about is what happens once that data is in the wild. What happens to the different endpoints that we are going to make use of? Why don't you give me a little bit on what it is you want to talk to me about today?
Absolutely. And maybe we can start off by sharing our screen, Jay.
Sure. Let me go ahead and bring it up. I'll let you take down that. There you go.
Absolutely. Great. And what we're going to talk about today is the security best practices. And as you very well said, that ETL, extract, transform, and load, which is basically a data engineering process. One thing which is very important, which as data engineers, while you're using this visual UI and data flows to build these solutions on, one of the key things is how do you secure the data? Because all these ETL processes are going to talk to different data, and these are going to be your production data, your customers' data, and so on. And so it is highly important for the ETL processes to make sure that the data that it interacts with is secure. At the same time, the data is stored after processing in a secure fashion. So in today's session, we're going to talk about some of the security best practices that data engineers should probably practice while building these beautiful data pipelines.
Absolutely. Let's get into it.
Sure. And I'm going to skip this topic because I'm sure last week Mark would have covered it. ADF is the hybrid data integration service, and it's pretty simple, easy to use. And you can watch the previous session, which will show up in the link, so you can go back and watch that session. Where we want to get started with is ADF has different components as such. So, you start triggering these data pipelines, and these data pipelines do interact with your data, for example, coming from databases, from your source databases. And so from ADF perspective, we have primarily two major computes. We call it integration runtimes. So we have different kinds of integration runtimes where our logic or the ETL logic runs on. And that is very important to know as a data engineer working with ADF, that our compute runtimes can be hosted by the customer, because that is where the transformation processes runs. And so you have to make sure you secure that environment. And then we also have an Azure integration runtime, which is really serverless, cloud scale, and we manage that integration runtime. So in that particular case, Microsoft certainly owns the security of that integration runtime. And then you have different considerations, which we'll get into now, while building your data pipelines to kind of enforce security, or I would say design, starts with security. So keep that in mind while designing it. And these are a few of the points which we'll cover today. These are some of the security considerations which you should start with while you start to build data pipelines in Data Factory. And before we get to these 8 points, I would also want to talk about the access control mechanisms. This is more to do with how do you decide or how do you basically isolate your data engineers into a common resource like a data factory resource, and what should be a good practice in terms of doing that? Should you have, like, typically customers have these kind of questions. Should I create one data factory and add all my data engineers? I have like 100 project teams. Should I add all of them into a single data factory, or shall I create n number of data factories, and for each project? So these are
Sure.
typical questions where customers start with, and in a way it is related to security, and I'm going to talk about that. Why? Because today, how ADF treats each of these resources, as we think this is, if you were to draw a security isolation model, we would say anything that you share or create in a single ADF instance is pretty much shared by all the users of that particular instance. So if we have an access control, the role-based access control, in a per factory basis. So it's very important when you start with your projects, you have a clear differentiation about what kind of data engineers you're going to have. How do you do project sharing? Can two different projects share the same resource? Because if they do, then you're going to share the pipelines and link services and data sets and the artifacts that you create. So is that okay? If not, just split it across different resources. You can have different resource groups with different resources, or even within the same resource group, you can have different ADF instances with ACL at the resource level. So
yeah, the one thing I would kind of be concerned with, obviously, is that kind of spread of credentials, because it always comes off to me that the more different, I guess, touch points that you're working with, be it, if we're using separate database servers to actually drop our data afterwards, we're going to have more credentials to work with. And so I guess one of the things I'd love to know is, are managed identities something that we can use to actually manage our data input and output?
Absolutely. That's a great question. Yes, we have support to manage identities, and I haven't reached there, but we'll get to that part when we start with authentication part. But we do support managed identities, which is one of the key functionalities that Azure Active Directory and managed resources on Azure provides. So that certainly eases up, the whole credential story, and I'm going to be right there with right on the next slide. So let's start off and get to the next slide, and we will talk about the managed identities and the kinds of authentication that ADF supports. So once you have decided on, I need a single ADF instance, and it's actually very easy to create n number of instances. It's not really equal to creating n number of databases. And the reason for that is ADF is just, when you create an ADF resource, you're just creating certain metadata. It's actually not going to bill you anything when you create a new data factory instance. You only get to start seeing any bill or when you start to run a job. So it's all serverless based. So think of it as
when compute time is used, I suppose, is the best way to kind of think about it.
Absolutely. So only for the compute is when you pay for it. So even if you have n teams and if you decide to split your data factories with different pipelines, that's not going to make any difference into the billing. So that's one thing. And then let's move forward. So let's talk about authentication and what are the good practices to do with authentication. And when we talk about authentication, we are talking specifically about connecting to your ETL sources and sinks, like connecting to a database, connecting to a storage account for the ETL purposes, extracting the data. And it could be Azure resources or it could be third-party resources. For Azure resources, certainly the best approach is to go with managed identities. You rightly mentioned that. And all the Azure services supports managed identities actually for authenticating into those services. And ADF maintains each factory instance maintains its own unique managed identity, which you can do the access control against into your data sources and grant relevant accesses. So even if you want to control like a table level access, that ADF1 needs to access only table 1 and ADF2 needs to access only table 2, you can set that kind of granularity in the AAD based access controls in Azure data sources. So that's what you can achieve with managed identities. The other advantage of managed identities, let me get to the slide, is one of the most challenging part for the security in terms of data engineering is making sure that the credentials aren't leaked. For example,
Mm-hmm.
if you're using SQL auth, or if you're using a user auth where you're passing credentials into the system, and we earlier talked about you having n number of data factories across your organizations. Now, it can be extremely tough to manage and ensure that your credentials are not misused, they are not leaked, and especially when people talk about security, they want to make sure that they have a full control over these credentials, and these credentials shouldn't be misused and stuff. So it's very difficult to control if you're using SQL auth. But if you're using AD based auth, you can literally build pipelines which does not contain any passwords. So this is as good as you logging into your iPhone or
Mm-hmm.
a biometric device without having to remember any pins or codes and things like that. So that's how data engineering is right now with MSI authentication. Now, what we did on top of that is for those data stores which do not support, by MSI, I mean managed identities. And so for data stores which do not support managed identities, using ADF, you can still make the whole experience for the data engineers passwordless or password free. And how do you do that? You do that using Azure Key Vault. So Azure Key Vault is that service where you can store in all your credentials for those which requires you to have user authentication like SQL auth and things like that, where you have to pass in the keys. Or for example, connecting to Amazon S3, you probably need the keys to connect to those Amazon S3 accounts. So in such cases, you might still want to store the keys into a key vault. And even if you have N factories, all the N factories can be trusted to the key vault using the managed identities, because as I said, ADF has a unique managed identity. So each instance contains or has a unique identity, which it can
Mm-hmm.
use to access the key vault during the runtime. So when you run your pipelines, it actually, during the runtime, fetches the credentials, and it does not store the credential anywhere. And in the whole process, you are ensuring that you do not have to share these credentials in a OneNote or through emails to your data engineers. So as the database admin or the data store admin, you are ensuring that you never pass or you never share credentials with anyone. And at the same time, you have the control and you can do an audit, see which factory accessed me. Or it's more to do with like a service to service authentication rather than
Mm-hmm.
you having to worry that a user might misuse the credentials from outside of work at home or from a different place, or a hacker might leak out these credentials and misuse it to access your data stores from a different place. So all those
That
things
could
is solved.
cause some incredible mayhem for a business. Complete mayhem, if you will.
Absolutely. And so I won't get much into the details about how managed identities work, because I'm sure there would be sessions before where we would have talked about managed identities and the value that it gives us. But certainly what I want to bring out in data engineering world, managed identity is like heaven. It helps you build pipelines without requiring any passwords, and it gives security teams, solves a lot of headache for them in terms of managing the credentials. So that's the
Yeah, I
beauty.
had Christos Mastakis on, and he talked to us a bunch about managed identities and like how they simplify that process and reduce, I guess, the amount of like username, password type credentials that you actually have to use in different situations.
Absolutely. So it's certainly great. And though we do support other auth mechanisms, but if you ask me, this is a great practice that you should use MSI for those data stores or managed identities for those data stores that supports it. And for those data stores which it does not support it, you should leverage Key Vault. And ADF integrates with Key Vault using managed identities in that case. So you are able to convert, a code free or password free interaction between ADF and that particular data stores.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, moving to the next point, which is we understood how authentication work. While ADF supports all the different kinds of authentication mechanisms, we do prefer to use managed identities and Key Vault in case if managed identities are not enabled. The next point we want to cover is metadata encryption. So while now you can connect to any data store securely, and your pipelines and data pipelines does not contain credentials in it, and so you can do CI/CD and stuff without any issues, no problems there. The next part is, how does ADF manage the metadata? And by metadata, what I mean is, when you define a pipeline, all the beautiful data flows that you saw in the previous week's session that Mark showed you, how does ADF under the hood ensure the security of those pipelines? Because sometimes it could contain monitoring data, it could contain monitoring data, and monitoring data could contain certain customer records as well. So there are things like, some of the customers, like maybe the pharmacy customers, might come back and say, my table names are secrets, and we should be able to hide them even from Microsoft as a service. So how do we go about doing that? So we want to just talk about this point, is that all the metadata that we store, we make sure we encrypt it, and we give an additional option for customers that they can bring in their own keys and encrypt on top of our encryption. You can do something like a double encryption, and which basically means is we cannot, even service provider cannot see any metadata information that you have.
That's really useful, especially if you're talking about organizations that have a certain amount of governance that they need, that their data sovereignty, it has to be in specific areas, and you want to make sure that it's encrypted over the wire. I can imagine why metadata encryption is just as important as, say, our standard data that we're utilizing.
Absolutely. We treat metadata as customers' data. So it should be given as the same priority as customers' data in terms of securing it. Now, the next part that we want to talk about, and it's very simple. We'll probably get into the demos later part of the time, but it's very simple to configure. And we do recommend customers to configure this in case if they want to configure, even if they don't configure customer managed key or CMK capability, Microsoft will always keep the metadata at rest encrypted. But if they wish to, the ideal scenario is you would probably want to do it while creating the data factory, or before adding any artifact into ADF, because it's going to start encrypting stuff, and you don't want to lose some data which has not been encrypted. So you generally do this at the beginning when you start your project. And it's a good thing. Maybe your dev factories may not have that encryption because you're dealing with sample data and stuff like that. But when you move into production, you can make sure that your production factories at the beginning, when you create them using ARM templates or using PowerShell or whatever way you use to create them, you can actually make sure it's configured right there. Okay, the next topic we want to talk about is the credential management. And we will talk about Key Vault here as well. And we will also talk about a couple of different mechanisms that ADF uses to manage customers' credentials. And these are credentials which ADF uses to connect to your data stores, the ETL, source, and sync systems. Now, in this particular case, I'm just going to show you how we encrypt credentials. So what you see on the left-hand side is when you create a link service, the link service is basically, of course, everything you do is visually. I want to make it clear. Everything in ADF is visual. What I'm showing you is basically the backend. When you use those visual tools to create a link service, we generate certain payloads. And this is that particular payload that we generated. So there are two cases when you use an AKV reference, or AKV stands for Azure Key Vault. So when you use an Azure Key Vault, we can still connect to that particular storage account. In this case, it's a storage account. It's a data lake where all the COVID data lives. And we don't have any secure strings in it, which means there is no credential information. It only contains a secret name and the Key Vault reference name. And we are going to, during the runtime, go there, authenticate using a managed identity, and then fetch the keys, and then connect to that particular storage account. So it's still using key-based auth. It's not using MSI, but it uses MSI when it goes and reaches out to AKV, and then AKV trusts this data factory service instance, and then hands over the key. And during the runtime, ADF is able to now connect to that storage account. So why I wanted to show this is, this is probably the best way to use, even for those data stores which do not support MSI auth. AKB reference is the best way, because when you start to do things like CI/CD and start deploying this code into different environments, you will always face this trouble that if you have credentials in here, it's not a safe thing to do, especially with CI/CD. You should keep your credentials out of the code. And so things get a bit dirty where you will have to replace these credentials during the deployment time and things like that. So the better way is to go with key vault. That's what we recommend. And on the right hand side, in case if you don't use if you don't use AKV reference, we still would make sure that we encrypt the credentials. So we have an encryption flow mechanism, where we will make sure that none of these credentials are exposed as plain text. And it's always encrypted. So we still use ADF service to encrypt it. But the problem with this is that it's limited to that service. So all the encrypted credential and all the encryption that you see over here, this cannot be transferred from one instance to the other instance. It's scoped at that factory level, which means this encryption, the GUID that we generate, or this string that we generate, cannot be used outside of this data factory instance, which is making sure that these credentials, once you give into data factory, it'll never give you out back. You can never retrieve it back from ADF once you set it. That's a great thing. That's what we do to secure your credentials. But at the same time, it disrupts your CI/CD process, because when you try and deploy this into a different environment, you will have to replace these credentials during the DevOps release process. And then, you have different options over there. You can use key vaults and stuff, and then have the credentials in there. But that's why I prefer the things on the left-hand side, because it's much cleaner for especially the DevOps piece as well. And you have no security information in there, no secure string information in there.
Yep. That I can see how there are some slight differences in the two, and how the one on the right, you've got your connection string and encrypted credential in there. And then, of course, on the left, we're just referencing the secret name. And that in itself reduces the potential for any of that getting out in the wild, and certainly helps provide us with a more secure pipeline process.
Absolutely. Now, as we touched upon earlier, there are a bit of different flows, especially when you are using an Azure integration runtime and when you're using a self-hosted integration runtime. So when you're using an Azure integration runtime, it's managed by us. So we encrypt it on the cloud service, and the data lives in the cloud service. When you're using a self-hosted integration runtime, that's what I mean by SHIR there. What happens is, this is something, a runtime, which is running in customer's environment. Customer takes the ownership of installing it in their environments. Now, what we do promise here is, anytime when you store a credential on a self-hosted integration runtime, or when you reference a self-hosted integration runtime in your connections in the link services, we will ensure that the encryption and the encrypted credentials lives on the SHIR, because that's what customers ask for. They don't want, so some customers do not want to store these credentials on the cloud, because some of these data stores are highly critical to them, and it's on-prem. And if it's on-prem, they would want to make sure that the credentials also always stays on-prem, which means we shouldn't violate by sending these credentials to an Azure service, like a cloud service, like an Azure integration run, like Key Vault or anywhere else. And hence, we give this functionality that when you're using an SHIR workflow in your workflows, we would make sure that the encryption happens locally using PowerShell. You have a PowerShell option where you can encrypt the credentials locally on the machine, and then give the encrypted credential in the payload, because all the metadata lives on the cloud. But what you can do is, you can directly encrypt your credentials on the self-hosted IR machine and give us the encrypted payload, that particular string, back to the payload in the UI. So that's one of the things which I want to call out. Many enterprise customers use that, because when we go through security audit, this comes as one of the requirements, and so we end up using things like self-hosted IR and using PowerShell to encrypt credentials on that. And those encrypted credentials are encrypted using Windows DP API. That's the secure platform or API offered by Windows to encrypt credentials and keep the credentials always encrypted. And it can never be misused out of that particular VM.
Gotcha. Hey, Abhishek, I want to make sure everybody knows, and just to give them a reminder, that we are taking a poll right now. If you'd like to go ahead and answer a poll, you can go to aka.ms/learntv. That's where we're currently asking if you have a data pipeline or ETL process in flight. Let us know. The other thing I really wanted everyone to be aware of, and I know I'm getting excited for it. I'm sure you are as well. It's Microsoft Build, and it's next week. You'll be able to go and register for free. Go ahead, get started now. It's register.build.microsoft.com. And there's tons and tons of great speakers, lots of amazing information. So make sure you get there now. And just to remind everybody, if you've got a question and you want to ask about data security, this is your chance. So go ahead, use your chat in whatever platform you're using, be it the Learn TV website, YouTube, Twitch, Twitter, you name it. Go ahead, send us your questions. So Abhishek, we've got about a half hour left. Why don't we keep going? Okay.
Absolutely. Yep. Then another thing to talk about. The payload encryption. By the payload encryption, what we mean is many customers do want certain customizations in the payload. For example, I might want to treat the table name as a secure string. What I mean by secure string in the system is whenever you declare anything as a secure string, we would ensure that those strings do not appear anywhere in the metadata. It'll always be encrypted, and that could be like a database table name as well. So by default, we would already set certain fields as secure strings. For example, credentials and stuff, secrets and stuff, we always mark it as secure string, and it's never shown on the UI, never shown on the metadata. It's always encrypted, and it's only decrypted during the runtime. But there are cases where as you know, as a platform, as Data Factory, you might want to additionally encrypt some custom fields that you have created in your data sets, right? Parameters or data sets, whatever you create. So just wanted to call it out here, as Data Factory as a platform is quite extensible. You can mark any of these properties as secure strings, and we'll make sure we encrypt it. If you're using them on SHIR, we keep them encrypted there on your machines. If you're using Azure IR, we keep them encrypted on our side, but it's always encrypted. And if you're using CMK feature on top of that, it's encrypted with your keys. So it's super flexible and super secure. You can decide how you want to secure your data sets, your pipelines and stuff. And again, this is just the code view, but you can do or build things using the visual UI and then edit the code as well and make it super secure.
And this is why when you're initially configuring Data Factory, it actually asks you for a Git repository, am I right? So that these types of bits and pieces can be saved.
I will get there in the demo.
Very cool.
Sure. So moving to the next point, we'll quickly cover data protection or security when it comes to transit and rest. So we have talked about till now is more authentication to data stores and encryption of the metadata, and then how do we handle credentials? Now getting into the next step is what happens when Data Factory engine starts to access your data in the transit and data at rest. So just to clarify it, Data Factory does not store your data at rest because it's an ETL service. And so it's always reading your data and transforming things in memory and then writing it somewhere. It might stage the data in case if you want to stage the data for performance reasons, like using SQL Data Warehouse to land it into the data warehouse using Polybase. So we might want to stage it on a blob storage and then call the Polybase engine. So in those cases, we do that, but it's always on your storage accounts and things like that. So it's basically on customer storage. And so for data at rest, we always rely on the different data stores and their options and security options that they provide. For example, SQL gives SQL TDE, Azure Blob Storage and Table Storage provides SSE. These are all encryptions that they provide. Some of them are transparent encryptions. They also support customer keys and stuff like that, which means you can bring in your own key to additionally encrypt the data at rest. So we comply with all those different encryption methodologies, and ADF can still access the data and write the data into those storage accounts. And when it comes to data in transit, we'll always keep the channel encrypted. So when we connect to a particular data store, we try and use TLS HTTPS 1.2, and so TLS 1.2, and so we'll make sure that the channel that we create with the data stores are always encrypted. Some of the data stores have enforcement. In fact, you cannot use HTTP and stuff like that, but always we try to use the latest security protocol as suggested by Azure. And so you don't have to worry about it. We'll keep upgrading the TLS versions. Sometimes some data stores might have a problem. They don't support TLS 1.2 or the latest versions. So you might have an option of reconfiguring that with a lower TLS version.
All right.
Okay, so moving next to the network security. And this is very important because while we talk about data in transit, one important thing is, how does ADF access data from data stores which are behind a virtual network? And this is quite a common question and a problem to solve, because earlier we started off with all the PaaS databases and PaaS services, and so everything was over the internet and it's easy to access it. But now customers do not want to expose these public endpoints, and that's fair. We don't want to suggest customers to expose the public endpoints.
Reduce your risk as much as you can.
Absolutely. So block all public connections, block all inbound connections, and so only let those trusted IPs access, or even better, if there's no public IPs accessing you, that's probably the best place to be in. And this is where we worked on a managed virtual network solution. Why we call it managed is, this is a virtual network which is created and managed by the Data Factory instance. So it's completely simple and easy for data engineers to get started with it. We will go through the demo. So it's as simple. Typically, all the networking stuff is not something which data engineers typically do. And data engineers do not want to get into that either. So we had to build something which is somewhere very secure. At the same time, ease of use is still there for the data engineers, and they are able to comprehend and use that. So with the managed virtual network, what we do is we create an isolated execution environment in a particular Data Factory instance. And using that, customers can, all the compute that ADF has, the Azure integration runtime that I'm talking about, will be provisioned in that isolated virtual network. And it's dedicated to the customer. It's dedicated to the ADF instance in specific. And so if customers want to connect to their data stores, which are behind VNet or which does not allow public endpoints, they can create a private endpoint against those data stores. All the Azure data stores already support private endpoints. And so you can create a private endpoint. And so it's an isolated network. Probably I'm going to move to the next slide and show you right here. This is how it would look like. And this is how the ADF managed virtual network looks like. So it's basically running the ADF compute, which is the Azure IR, which is managed elastic infrastructure. So it can scale out to any big data computing needs. And if it were to access your data stores, which do not have any public endpoints like storage or SQL data warehouse, Synapse data warehouse, it can access it through the private endpoints, which make sure that it solves the data exfiltration problem, because you are basically creating a 1:1 private channel between ADF instance or ADF compute, or at least the network where the ADF compute is, and the data warehouse or the storage account. So that's what private endpoint does. And you can see it's all 10.something.IP addresses. These are all private IP ranges.
Private IPs.
So none of these network request goes through a public internet. It goes through a private channel, which basically goes through the Microsoft backbone. So everything happens behind Microsoft backbone, and it also solves the data exfiltration problem because it's like a 1:1 or a dedicated connection created for you between your endpoint and your storage account. So it does not use like a common Microsoft backbone network or something. So it's a dedicated path or channel between that VNet and your storage account. So it's super, super secure.
Very cool. We got about 20 minutes left, Abhishek. What do you want to show us next?
Yes, so I'm just going to quickly complete that and then get into the demo. So give me another couple of minutes and we'll run through the slides. So the next couple of things that I want to talk about is the Azure policy integration. That's also one key important service that Azure has, which helps in enforcement. So we talked about all the good parts like managed identities and stuff in the beginning. Now, who does the enforcement? Or is there a way you can validate and make sure as a data engineer, what if I miss to implement managed identities in one of my data stores or create a connection with managed identities in one of my data stores? So it could cause problems where, to err is human and people can make mistakes. And this is where policy integration comes in, where you can predefined policies on your data factories so that your data engineers never make a mistake. They will always follow the same security guidelines that your organization may have. So this is where policy integration works. And we already have some preset policies, which we created, which we heard from customers, pretty much like in focused on security. We do not want to allow any other authentication mechanisms except managed identities. For example, that's one of the example policies that you would see. And that really helps because many customers, once they apply this across this subscription, there's no way that any data engineer would make a mistake and use key-based auth and then suffer. So those are the things that Azure policy integration brings in. That was that. And then the last part is if you need the freedom or if you want within the same data factory instance, you want to define clearly a differentiated role. So we already give you a couple of roles like reader role, data factory reader role, and contributor role, but those might not be enough for differentiated use cases. So what we hear from customers is there might be a role requirement. Let's say for a ADF operator, I might want to maybe rerun the pipelines and stuff like that, but I might not be allowed, or I should not be allowed to create a link service, which is basically connection to a data store, because that's something like a higher privileged action. And so I don't want all my data operators to have that action because they might create something by mistake or to a wrong endpoint, which can cause harm to our organization in terms of leakage of data. And so we want some custom roles. And if you want to customize that, the good part is ADF exposes all these functionalities in terms of actions. And so anything, everything is configurable. In this particular case, this is an example of a custom role which defines a data factory operator role, which lets you control, run your pipelines, change the triggers, but it does not allow you to create a new link service. So you don't see anything which starts with link service. It gives you mostly the read permissions, so you can actually see it, you can monitor it. For example, the data factory, you can read everything, all the artifacts within data factory. But when it comes to deployments, you don't have the right permissions, so you cannot deploy things like pipelines and stuff. But you can do some debug runs. So data pipelines, pause, action, resume. And so you can pretty much customize certain actions that you want and some actions which you don't want. So you can use the custom defined role and what fits in well for your data engineers or what your requirement is. You can set up a custom role. So this is something which I also want to highlight. This is pretty helpful, especially in defining, user A has access to create link services. User B does not have access to create link service, but they can create pipelines. Yes, you can do all those segregations with custom roles.
Very, very cool. So if you have any questions, everybody, you can go ahead. You can put them in the chat. We've got about 15 minutes left, which means we've got 15 minutes to demo, Abhishek, and I'm going to let you kind of take off and show me what you've got here. And obviously, if we get any questions in the meantime, I will let you know, okay?
Sure. So I'm going to quickly start with data factory creation best practices. So I'm simply going to use a resource group. What I want to run through is when you're creating a new resource.
And so this is just the standard create via the portal.
Yeah, yeah. And one of the good practices is that you should use Git. And there are a lot of good practices of using Git. Of course, it helps you save the code that you're doing, the visual UI builder, all the visual definitions or pipelines that you build. The definitions would be stored in Git, so it can be used for recovery purpose. It can be used for collaborations across team, and then of course this continuous deployments and stuff can be triggered in as well. So of course you can get wellness of all the Git brings in. So you can configure that later as well. No harms in that part, because we do understand as data engineers sometimes you might not have these fields to fill in. So you can quickly skip that part, and once you create a new data factory instance, there's a beautiful UI and you can select ADO or GitHub right from there. So you can do it later as well. The next part that you need to keep in mind is the network environment. So we talked about that, that you can have your compute, the ADF compute, in a virtual network which is managed by ADF. So you can choose to create a default configuration where you're saying that all my default compute engines are going to be in this managed VNet, and I'm always going to use a private endpoint to connect to my data store. So this is how you enforce security, by making sure that all the compute environments that you create in this data factory instance will be created in this virtual network. And then we also talked about self-hosted integration runtime. So sometimes customers want to make sure, because this self-hosted IR communicates with our backend service on the cloud. And since it does that communication, many customers do not want that communication, even though it's a control kind of action communication. It's not really a data related communication, but it's control action or control plane communication. But even then, customers want to keep it private. And if you want to do that, you can even use private endpoints. What it would do is it would create a private endpoint in your virtual network, and your self-hosted integration runtime running on your virtual machines would basically leverage that private endpoint. And so you can say it's more secure, because there's no way anyone can access the private endpoints which were dedicated to your self-hosted integration runtime.
Makes sense to me.
And then the next step is when you get into the advanced section, this is where the CMK or double encryption kicks in. So you can actually select this option in here, and you can choose a key vault. So how it works is you have to bring the key from the key vault, and to connect to that particular key vault, you need some authentication mechanism, right? And before you create ADF instance, once you create ADF instance, yes, you have the managed identity, because it comes while you create the managed service, which is data factory in this case. But since you don't have that right now, I haven't created this data factory, so you have to use a user assigned managed identity, UAMI. So this is where you have to select a UAMI that you might have. And so when you do this selection, data factory will make sure it uses the key specified by you over here, and the particular identity it uses to authenticate into this particular key vault instance, right? And so this is what that is about. And then you can just click on review and create, and you will have a new data factory version with all the CMK encryption, and you can get started with that.
Sounds good to me.
Now,
so we got our data factory is created. Let's take a look next at what you got for me. And while we get ready, just want everyone to know we're taking questions, and we've got one right now, Abishek. What will be the role of Azure AD in ADF security?
It's immense. So everything in ADF that you see, right from the login into this ADF instance, because everything is governed by Azure Active Directory, right? So I'm part of Azure Active Directory. So all users are part of Azure Active Directory. And so we at the end, a couple of slides back, we did explain about roles and how you create data factories and what kind of access permissions you want to set. For example, user A needs to have access to create these pipelines. User B might not be able to create these pipelines, but they can see these pipelines and monitor these pipelines. So all these things are governed and controlled due to the wellness of Azure Active Directory, because it lets us define fine-grained access control. So everything comes from Active Directory. So the story of RBAC, role-based access control, is inherited from Active Directory. So it's a huge role that AAD plays, not just in connectivity to other data stores, but also in terms of securing the whole environment that you see in front of the screen and the permissions that I have to create these or author these elements. Everything is governed by AAD under the hood.
Very, very cool. So we got let's say 8 minutes, because I want to give you a chance to sign off. Let's go ahead and continue with your demo, and we'll go ahead and finish up after that.
Sure, absolutely. So once you have a new factory instance created in a secure environment, you can start with Git configuration if you have not already done that during the creation process, because this is typically, you can come here, click on this configure button, and I had some items which were not saved in, and hence I'm just discarding them. But you can select the repository. We do support DevOps, and we do support ADO, Azure DevOps, and GitHub, both of them. So you can choose any one of them. Select, again, you can see Azure Active Directory comes in. So everything is based on that. The whole authentication or integration between the services that we have, like ADF integrating with ADO, again, using Active Directory. So you can do fine-grained accolading over there. And I'm going to quickly select one of my repositories here, accounts, and my project name. And I can define.
So you're adding your repo, you're putting in the branch that you're going to be saving it in. Gotcha.
Absolutely. And even if you set up Git later, it's absolutely fine, because we let you import all the existing resources which are already deployed without Git in your factory into the Git. So it really helps you in terms of getting everything back into the Git, which acts as the source of truth or backup of all the effort that you have put in the UI.
So if a data factory is incorrectly removed or something by, maybe just miscommunication, if you have the Git repository with how it's constructed, you'll be able to build a new one and get back to work.
It's extremely easy. So here's one of my Git repositories, and you can see it contains the everything that we used in the UI, from the pipelines, all the pipelines that we created. You can see all the JSONs. This is backup of all your code which got generated using the UI right here in the Git. And even if that data factory instance gets deleted, I have nothing to worry. Number one, why? Because I have stored all my credentials in Key Vault. And so nothing is encrypted into a particular factory instance. And so I can simply deploy or create a new factory instance and bind this Git repo to that, and all my code voila works fine. So that's how simple it is.
Very cool.
Okay. Now, a couple of things. We talked about link services and encryptions. So let's quickly understand that in the visual UI, how it works like. I didn't want to scare everyone by showing all those beautiful, JSON and stuff, but this is typically what you would do if you are trying to connect to a particular any data store. Here's a bunch of all the data stores that we support. What you would see is we do support Key Vault. So start with creating a Key Vault and reference this particular Key Vault in all your link services that you're creating. For example, I already have a Key Vault. So if I create a SQL database or anything which is outside of Azure as well, you will have an option. Even if you use a SQL auth, which you should typically use managed identity. But let's say if you use SQL auth because a database does not support or whatever, it's a test database, so you can use that. You always have this option of getting the credentials or the secrets from Key Vault. So once you created that Key Vault link services, you would come here, select Key Vault, and choose the secret name. So you need to go back to your Key Vault and simply create a secret over there. For example, you can add a new secret, click on generate, add, let's say, MySQL auth, and then add in the secret value here. And once you do that and create it, just copy this out. This is all you need to access the SQL Server, because this is where your credentials is. It's in a key vault over here. And then you come back to your factory and just put in the secret name. So this secret name does not contain a secret. It's just a placeholder to the secret.
Sure.
And so in the ADF world, you're never passing it by, and you can provide the other fields like the username, and then simply go ahead and create this server name and a database name. So once you select all these things, you will be able to create this, and that's how it is. So it will not contain any secrets or credentials in it. It's going to be very safe, and it's going to be very CI/CD friendly as well.
Very, very cool. So we've got about 3 minutes left.
Okay.
Any quick ones that you want to show me before we go?
Yeah, I think the last one which I want to show you is the managed VNet we talked about, and how it makes or simplifies things for end customers. So here's that is. This is where you will see all the managed private endpoints. So you don't have to do anything. If you have created a data factory with the default managed private endpoint connections, well and good. If you haven't, don't worry about it. You can always create a new integration runtime. And within this, you can select the virtual network configuration to enable. And so when you do that, you are saying that this particular compute instance, integration runtime 1, whenever it's created or used in your data pipelines, will always leverage the virtual network. And so it'll only communicate to your data stores through that. So once you create this, you can then start to create connections within your databases using private endpoints. And how you do that?
So we're not transmitting that data over the internet. We're using these private connections within Azure.
Absolutely. So here's my storage account, and you cannot access the storage account using even the Azure portal, because you cannot see the data because it does not allow you to see the data. But what you can do is, and this is that particular storage account, here it is the same storage account that I'm connecting through that. If I try and access the files over here, for example, let's try and get to the containers. Let's see if we do that. Go inside that. And you will see it shows unable to load the data. You can't load it, and it shows an error. Of course, it should, because it's accessing through Azure portal, through a public endpoint. And so it doesn't allow you. But if you come back to Data Factory and create a new link service using this particular storage account, you will be able to do that. So here's my link server's name. I can quickly show by creating a quick data set right here.
Okay.
It was this one. And then let's, one thing I didn't do is I had to enable interactive authoring. So probably it's going to take a couple of minutes, so we can skip that part. But once we enable that, we would be able to see that. So we need a compute in the managed VNet, which can actually do these operations for us. But it would take a few seconds or maybe a minute or so to create that. So maybe we can skip that part, but you've got to trust me on that. So once you enable this, you will be able to browse your data over here using the interactive authoring experience here in the managed VNet. So,
well, Abishek, that brings us to the very, very end. Very end. You gave me a lot to think about. You shared a ton of information on security and how important it is to our users. And so let's just bring this up just to remind everybody all these security considerations that you should put into your data pipeline process. Abishek, if people want to find you on the internet, there is your Twitter handle. You just point right down there. That's how everybody can find you. But I want to thank you for being part of this today. It was really great to learn more about this subject.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
No problem. So everybody, next week we'll be off. Next week you'll get a replay of the Brendan Burns interview because it's built. And so I don't want to do too much to confuse you all. I want you all to be focused on build. So until then, let's give everybody the big wave goodbye. We'll see you next time. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks for watching Azure FunBytes.